Hello and welcome to Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel. As you can see, we're on the road again. This time we're in historic Amherstburg, coming to you from the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. We've chosen this location because of my first guest today, and you'll meet her very shortly. We'll also introduce you to the music of the Border Patrol. Now, that first guest I mentioned is Kimberly Simmons, a local author who has recently released a book called To the River, The Remarkable Journey of Caroline Quarles, an Underground Railroad freedom seeker. This is the story of Kimberly's great-great-great-grandmother who escaped slavery and fled from St. Louis, Missouri to Sandwich, which is now part of Windsor. She made that journey with bounty hunters hot on her trail. This book is an excellent read, and Kimberly is here to tell us about this exciting story. Welcome to Scribes and Songsters. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, there's so much to talk about in this quite extraordinary book about a very remarkable woman, but the author is also a remarkable woman. So tell me a little bit about yourself. I understand that you wanted to grow up to be a dancer.
Yes, that was the original plan. I went to Eastern Michigan University, and Eastern Michigan is known for their dance, school of dance. And at one point, that was my goal. I never danced professionally, but I took dance lessons from the age of 5. So by the time I was 18, I was pretty well along. I was on point. So that was the goal. However, I think my first question when I arrived at Eastern was, and exactly how much do teachers make? And after I picked myself off the floor, I said, well, perhaps that's not my journey. So literally went into business administration. And for a time, I've been a branch manager for, a local Detroit bank, which was at the time called National Bank of Detroit. Which no longer exists. However, 20 years financial career. I've worked in retail for 40 years, part-time, full-time. I've been fundraiser for the DIA, for the Detroit Institute of Arts, and I've been director of member relations for the Detroit Regional Chamber. So I've done a little bit of a lot.
Well, certainly based on this incredible story of your great-great-great-grandmother, you certainly have quite the history. So let's talk about her.
Okay.
Who is Caroline?
Who was she?
Yes.
I would say Caroline was a very persistent and curious 16-year-old woman. She was born into slavery. She was born into a family that not only were blood relations, but were slave owners. She was owned at birth by her grandfather. Her father was a son of the house. And up until her 16th birthday, that was the life that she knew. She was what they called an octoroon. And as the term points to, she was an 8th Black. So she had quite a little bit of heritage within her. She was Native American partially. She was French, which descriptions of her say that she looked French.
She's also described as very beautiful.
She had a nickname. They called her the pretty one. That was her nickname by town people and folks that saw her. She was blue-eyed and freckled, keen-featured, high cheekbones, long jet black hair. And I guess if you were to term what does a French woman look like, supposedly that's the look. Mm-hmm. But that was what she looked like. She was slight, 5'5"-ish, and slight of build. There's only one photograph that we have of her that exists. And that was a photograph that was taken at the end of her life, when she was in her 50s, right before she passed. But you can see that she would have been a very beautiful woman, mm-hmm. As is said. She was nicknamed the Pretty One by people in and around the community that she lived in.
What was she treated like in those first 16 years?
Well, people ask, well, she was a daughter of the house, and her grandfather made a pet of her, as they said. He used to take her places with him. And I say to people that make that statement, but she was enslaved.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know how you measure the slavery to, oh, well, it wasn't so bad versus I'm enslaved.
Yeah.
She was the housemaid before she escaped of her aunt. Her grandfather, who owned her at birth, Dr. Robert Quarles, who was a Revolutionary War soldier, and he passed away in 1827. His will gave her ownership because she was property to her aunt, Louisa Ann Quarles, who eventually married a man named Hall, Charles Hall, who became her owner because her ownership passed from her aunt, then to her husband. Women couldn't own property at the time. So she eventually was owned by her paternal uncle, Charles Hall, who in the annals of St. Louis history was listed as a merchant living in downtown St. Louis.
What was the straw that made her decide she was going to escape?
I don't know if it was a straw. The oral history, as has been passed by the family, is the fact that she was threatened. Of course, women of that age and time, mid-1800s, their hair was their glory. I think it still is. And she apparently didn't follow directions that were left of her, and that was to stay in the house and finish scrubbing the paints, which meant scrubbing the floors. Mm-hmm. She was the housemaid and had decided to do something different from what she was instructed to do. So they cut her hair. Her aunt got mad at her, and she cut her hair. Well, again, that was almost cutting off an arm, is your hair. Yes. And that made her realize, I guess, at 16, I believe she was already beginning to find out that she was different from those that are in the house with her. Because at the time, she would have been living amongst her first cousins. She was the daughter of a man. His name was Robert Pryor Quarles, who was the son of her owner, her grandfather. That was her father, and he lived in the house with her. He never owned her. But he lived in the house with his wife. Carolyn was the product of a union that happened between he and her mother. Her mother's name was Maria, which would have been my fourth great-grandmother, who was another enslaved person within the household. So she was kind of a gift to him from his father for his wedding, kind of a pre-wedding gift, let's put it that way. And there were actually two girls born. There was Carolyn, who was the youngest, and then there was another sister who passed away before Carolyn left. But he never owned her. And people ask me, well, it had to be no. Think about that. Her ownership, if she had been owned by her father within a house where he had a wife and other children, she looked like him, I'm sure. We have a picture of him. She looked like him, probably looked identically to the other children of his, half brothers, half sisters, and cousins. You put two and two together, and the wife doesn't want to see her. So therefore, she was owned by his sister. So it's kind of, we have to really take ourselves back and think about what the world was like then. And this was the world they lived in.
Now she set out on a treacherous journey by herself.
1,000 miles, yes.
And along the way, she met people, some who helped her and some who betrayed her.
Yes, when she left, she made a decision. And the decision was made rather, she was determined. Two things that played into that. Carolyn would have been known as what was termed fancy girl. What's a fancy girl? Well, fancy girls even had their own slave market. They actually had markets to sell them along with their children. Fancy girls, generally speaking, were the daughters of slave owners, or the granddaughters, in her case, of a slave owner. They were bred. They were specifically bred to be, call it what you will, concubine, mistress, rape victim, you can call it what you will, of slave owners. And probably one of the most famous fancy girls that we are learning more and more about now is Sally Hemings. That was Jefferson's
Right.
Slave. That said, she knew in the back of her mind, she knew that that is what was going to eventually happen. And so did her paternal grandmother. Her paternal grandmother, the widow of the house, Patsy Quarles, who would have been my 5th great grandmother, was still living. Her husband died. She was living. She had very little to say about the running of the house, of course, again, a woman. However, the maternal instinct always kicks in.
Yeah.
So this is her grandmother, her grandchild that she's looking at, just like the rest of her grandchildren, and they're having discussions, and she sees this woman blooming in front of her, and she knows that she's in danger of not being able to stay with the family. She's owned by a man that's not a blood relation, and this is a business. So it was probably in her future, very soon, that she would be sold down the river. And that's where that term comes from, sold down the river.
Yes.
You would have been sold to the lower South to work, to either work in the fields. In her case, she would have been set up in some sort of a home somewhere. And that was plaguing her.
Yeah. How far did she get by herself? Because she did part of the way on the journey. She did have a man she traveled with who was very good to her.
She left on the 4th of July. And yes,
there's an irony.
No, it was intentional. Number one, people wouldn't have been there, been out celebrating the 4th. And she was born of a Revolutionary War family. So that date is very special, was very special. So it was even her proving a point that if you can celebrate your freedom, I'm going to go find mine. So on the 4th of July in 1843, she had put together a little package, left outside, a dress, old silk dress, a veil, and $100 in cash that she had earned herself from making lace, which is a trade she had. And she left with the full knowledge of her grandmother. Her paternal grandmother knew she was leaving. She had hinted at it. She had asked her what would happen because she needed to go find out what that thing called freedom was, because she didn't have it. So on the 4th of July, 1843, she left. And she literally left when everyone else was not paying attention. She walked to the Mississippi River. She walked up and bought a ticket on a ferry boat and went across the river to what is known as Alton, Illinois. At that point, technically, she was free. However, she was greeted looking for people that helped her. She was greeted by a young man who was a dock worker, had been enslaved. And when he saw her, he went, she looks like, well, maybe I'll just kind of. So he asked her, he says, I don't know. He says, I'm not being rude, but if you're escaping, don't stay here. So he helped her. He was the first one that helped her. He guided her to a stagecoach that took her to a little bit further up the river to Galena. And from Galena, Illinois, she rode another stagecoach to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it was there that she got a lot of help. Hence the story across country, from Milwaukee to the south side of Chicago, which 40-minute journey on I-94 now, but then it was a couple days, and they spent a great deal of time around the south side of Chicago because going through Chicago itself was dangerous. Yeah. Chicago was known to be an abolitionist stronghold, so they had to go around Chicago to do that. And
she eventually got to Sandwich, and eventually got married and had children. And
That she did.
it's quite remarkable. And, you know, I really thank you for writing this, because these are the stories we need to hear. These are the stories that shaped our culture, our country, and made such a difference in where we live. And everyone should read this. Thank you so much. So, if you have an opportunity, please pick up this book. It's called To the River, The Remarkable Journey of Caroline Quarles. It really is an important thing to read. Well, my next guests are members of the Windsor-Detroit band called Border Patrol. But before you meet them, here's a music video of Border Patrol playing Toxic Thought Machine.
Scenic sights till I find a place with neon near the door, empty seat next to the bar top, and a heavy-handed pour. I will drive through the artificial light, through our battered bits of city and our rusted scenic sights, till I find a place with neon near the door, empty seat next to the bar top, and a heavy-handed pour.
Well, Cody Howard and Dave Tunyas are members of Border Patrol. The Windsor-Detroit lyrically driven folk rock group blends elements of traditional bluegrass and folk rock with punk and indie expression. They feature vocal harmonies and surprisingly upbeat melodies about our impending doom and the monotonies of everyday life and love in this modern age. They're releasing a new CD in March titled The Worst Excuses. Love it. Cody and Dave, welcome to Scribes and Songsters.
Thank you for having us on.
That was a great piece of music we just heard. Really upbeat.
That's kind of our wheelhouse, is to try to do songs that sound upbeat, but maybe are not upbeat in content.
Right. I've noticed. I listened to all of your stuff, and you do. It's very real. So tell me a bit about yourselves before I talk about your music. So where are you both from?
I'm originally from Breeze, Illinois, which is down by St. Louis, but I live in Hamtramck. I met Cody in Windsor here, actually.
And so you were grew up here?
I'm native from Brantford, Ontario.
Oh, yeah?
Although I feel like I've lived here long enough now that this is essentially my home. I think I moved here when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I've been here since. So, from Brantford, but Windsor's really home for me.
Now, were you sort of musically inclined right from being young boys?
I took like piano lessons and played like trumpet in like middle school and stuff. So like, I mean, I had like some lessons and not really a musical family or anything though. Mm-hmm. I kind of like high school came around and stopped playing some of those and then picked up guitar towards the end of high school and have stuck with that one, but not really trained in any classical sense.
Yeah. What about you?
It's kind of the opposite for me. I had a very like musical and supportive family. So like, family get-togethers where grandma sitting around the couch playing songs and all the aunts and uncles, everyone's singing along with them.
Gosh, you sound like my Newfoundland family.
Right. So I mean, definitely a lot of encouragement was put on me to start young, and so I got into playing piano, and then picked up my dad's guitar and started strumming around with that for a while, and just sort of carried it ever since.
Do you tour around? Or are we just in this area?
We haven't in a while, but we took a couple years, not on like a hiatus, but just trying to get like a permanent, reliable personnel and trying to get the album that's coming out end of March, trying to get all the sort of ducks in a row for that, get all the recording, just the actual like people that we needed for producers and engineers and the money and all that lined up. So there were a couple years where we kind of would maybe play 1 or 2 shows every couple months. But when we put out the first album, we did do a little bit of touring. It was mostly just like here, Toronto. We got as far as Montreal into Canada, St. Catharines. We did like Chicago, St. Louis, a couple places like stateside, but we're hopeful that we can try to line some of that stuff up.
We learned very quickly in attempting to tour out into like the Midwest states that it's not a very easy process, especially if you don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
So the first time we tried to cross for this tour, 3 of the 5 members were detained for several hours.
Wow.
And then we learned about what a P2 visa was.
Oh.
We didn't necessarily think that we needed one if we weren't actually making money. But apparently you do.
Immigration, if you have any potential for making money.
Yeah.
It's funny because they define like compensation as like anything.
Right.
So,
beer.
You would make a poor choice saying that you're receiving, a stack of napkins or drink tokens or really any form of like remuneration.
Someone is making money even if it's not you. So
right.
Mm-hmm.
So there have been all these sort of unforeseen hurdles. We love that we get to kind of have a footprint in both the countries.
Yeah.
And it's a real unique position to be in a border town like this. But like it has so many logistic hurdles.
Now, you write your own stuff? Do you both write?
I usually am the guy with the lyrics and like the structure of it. And then since my musical ability doesn't really extend too far outside of like playing the chords and keeping time. So then I have to take it to the people who actually know how to finesse it and like add the flair to it. So Cody is a really excellent just fingerstyle player. And I think when I met you weren't playing banjo, right? I just kind of asked you if you could.
Yeah, I think it was born out of necessity. You couldn't just have, 2 dark-haired, bearded guys playing guitar next to each other on singing. We wanted to add some variety. So given that I had a lot more experience in that area of like fingerstyle picking, it was like, well, guitar and banjo. I mean, that's that makes sense when you put the two together.
Yeah.
So
now how much time do you spend on your music? You've got other jobs or ways of making a bit of money. How much time do you get to actually devote to what you're doing?
For me, it's usually, there's usually something a couple nights a week. Mondays are always typically our practice days, so we're getting together typically for a couple hours for that. My Tuesday night is my open mic thing that I host, so I always have to perform at that in addition to just keeping it running. Wednesdays, I host a podcast over there that's about songwriters, so doing some kind of musical there. Usually on the weekends, every now and again, you'll have at least some kind of show. And then just when you're just kind of fiddling around at the house, right?
That's it. Any real spare time when you're kicking around, it's a good opportunity to learn something, play something, mess around, shop as we call it.
Yeah. You've got this album coming out. Anything else going on?
That's kind of the biggest thing right now. So in keeping with the sort of spirit of the band and the whole cross-border thing, we're going to have 2 releases. One of them March 28th at Meteor downtown Windsor there across from Fog. That one's going to be with Years of Earnest and The Universe featuring Ray, some of our favorite artists in town. And then the following Saturday, we're going to go ahead and release it stateside at the Ant Hall in Hamtramck, which is attached to the Ghost Light, the kind of sketch comedy improv place. And that one will be with Jack Oates and Pancho Villa's Skull. So we're super looking forward to that.
Well, I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much for having us.
I can imagine what it would be like being in an audience with your kind of music. It's when I was listening to it, I thought, this is fun to listen to. So in person, you must be great.
We try to keep it fun. There's
Thank you.
Actually, a lot more dancing than you might expect, as long as people aren't listening to the words.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us.
Well, on that note, we'll say so long for now. I hope you've enjoyed my wonderful guests, Kimberly Simmons, Cody Howard, and Dave Tonieth. Thank you to Tony Toldo and the Toldo Foundation for your support, and also thanks to Neil and Tina Queering. Thank you to our producers, Brian Sweet and Gary Glass. Grateful thanks to you for watching. I hope you'll come back and join me again here on Scribes and Songsters. I'm Veronique Mandel.